Now, to prove that, we did a scientific study, because this slide is only theories and ideas. It makes sense, but you need some evidence, right? So, to do that, we tested some sprinters and rugby players on the treadmill, and we could synchronize the force output on the treadmill, so we could measure their force output and their muscle activity. So you see on the right, you have the EMG, the electromyographic activity of many, many muscles of the leg. Gluteus, hamstring, vastus, triceps. You can see the electrodes on the guy. Then we filmed the motion of their knee and foot, just to know exactly what happened. And to have an idea of their muscle strength, we used an isokinetic test. This is not the perfect test, but we don't have right now the possibility of measuring the muscle force during the exercise. So we take isokinetic measurements. So it was a big study, but our hypothesis was very simple. Our hypothesis was that the athletes with the best horizontal force output were strong in the hip and the hamstrings, and they were also able to activate the hips extensors and the hamstrings a lot during the cycle. Because remember, it is not only being strong, it's also being strong in a very high speed context. So if your muscles are super strong, but you're not able to activate them during sprinting, it's useless. So we'll go to the results, but here, this is the study, and you can read it if you want. And you can understand in this graph that we synchronize the force output with the muscle activity. So we know exactly during the sprint cycle what muscle group is working when and with what intensity. Let's go to the first analysis here. So this graph is showing you step by step the EMG activity of 3 different groups. Vastus lateralis, so it's a knee extensor, it's a quadriceps muscle. The biceps femoris, it's a hamstring muscle, it's in black. And the gluteus muscle in gray. The number of steps of the right leg, so it shows you step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, the acceleration. And first thing that you observe is that in the first half of the stance, so the upper panel shows you when the foot is on the ground. When the foot is on the ground, the biceps femoris activity is not very high. So the hamstrings don't work a lot when the foot is on the ground. Okay? But when the foot is just before touching the ground, so this is what we call the end of the swing. So the end of the swing is exactly before touching the ground. At the end of the swing, the biceps femoris activity was maximum. So it means that when your foot is in the air, just before touching the ground, you activate your hamstrings a lot. You activate your hamstrings as much as the gluteus and as much as the vastus. So it's cool in terms of performance, because it means if you activate your hamstrings, you will generate a lot of backward motion and maybe a lot of force output. But it's also very dangerous because, as you know, the swing phase is the moment where the hamstring muscle is facing the highest risk of injury. Now, let's go to the summary of the results of this study, because there were many results in that study. First, as we saw before, the horizontal force is super important, especially at high speed. Second, the result of our study showed that, as our hypothesis was predicting, the best guys at the horizontal force output were the guys who had the highest hip extensor force, the gluteus in concentric and the hamstring in eccentric, but also the highest EMG activity just before touching the ground. So to summarize, if you want to produce a high horizontal force output, you need strong hamstrings and strong gluteus muscles, and you also need to activate these muscles a lot. So again, and this will be related to the exercises we will see at the end of the course, remember, it's not only the strength of the muscles, it's the strength of the muscles in a very high velocity context. This is very different. Of course, as you may know, the strength of the hamstring is related to the risk of injury, so we can summarize the results by saying, well, if you work on the hamstring force and the hamstring activity, you can work on both performance, sprint acceleration, and injury prevention. So we call that the prepare and repair approach. Now, if I summarize this and I talk about transmission, 2 points here. In the transmission, there is the horizontal force output, but there is also this point, the foot. You have to remember that the foot muscles, the ankle muscles, and the lower leg muscles will be very important in the transmission. Because if in this picture the athlete doesn't have a strong ankle and foot, his powerful push will be basically dissipated. It will not be correctly transmitted. And look at the muscles here. They are already contracted. What does that mean? It means that even before touching the ground, the athlete is ready to transmit the force. My opinion is that we should train football players much more than we do in transmitting the force. So everything is related to the ankle strength, the ankle stiffness, and I would summarize this by saying that a chain is as strong as its weakest link. What does that mean? It means if your body is very strong, but your feet and ankle are weak, you will not transmit this force correctly. So you can have very strong players and you can wonder, wow, he's not sprinting very well. Yes, that's because his foot and ankle are not trained enough. So remember, it's all about, let's say, ankle strength, foot strength, and core strength, how your body is transmitting the force. I want you to take a look at this video. Of course, these are not football players, but you can have the same situation in football. I want you to look at the athlete on the right, the one who is wearing some spike shoes. Look at the foot of this athlete. So, look at the picture. It is the athlete with no t-shirt on. The athlete with the white t-shirt on. Look at his ankle here. When his ankle will touch the ground, it will not deform, which means he will transmit almost all of the force now to the ground. You see? No deformation. It means there is no energy leak in how he moves. Okay? So this is very important because now take a look at the next right step. Don't take a look at the left guy because he's not wearing shoes. Here. This is a beautiful force transmission. This is what you want with your football players. Understand that? And everything here is related to the ankle strength. So now, in this part of the course, we will see some exercises that I propose. Of course, you can find many, many more exercises to improve these two capabilities: hip extensors and ankle foot strength capability. So, in the coming slides, there will be a lot of different exercises that I will detail, but I need you to remember something. You, as a coach, you can generate many, many exercises if you respect these essential rules. First, you need to have a stiff ankle and knee. This is something you should tell the players systematically. Have a stiff ankle and have a stiff knee. You need to have a short contact time as much as possible. Why? Because if you focus on a short contact time, immediately you will generate a stiff ankle and you will generate a good energy transmission. You need to always, always, always focus on pushing forward and not up. So if you do any type of exercise, remember that the main guideline is push forward. And finally, you should try to avoid trunk flexion. Why? Because if I want my body to move forward, I don't want my trunk to deform because it takes time and there will be less force transmitted. So let's go with the exercises and let's try to see how you can implement that in your context. Final guideline, stay stable. What does it mean? It means that if I'm doing a bouncing exercise, a jumping exercise, if I want to stay stable on the ground, I will force my system to be very stiff and very strong. If you have players shaking like this on the ground when they land, you know they don't have a good ankle stiffness and they don't have a good force transmission. Let's go. The first exercise here, will be helpful to improve hip extensors power. So you need to have two partners, two players, exercising like this. So always the same. Stiff ankle, short contact time, forward push. So you don't want them to skip vertically, you want them to skip forward. Why do we add some resistance? Always the same, because you overload the system and you work more on the hip extensors. Second exercise, it's about the same, but instead of doing some extended limb skips, you do some lunges forward, okay? So in these lunges, you work much more on the hip extensors because the hip is much more flexed at the beginning. Of course, and this will be the case for all the exercises, you cannot do that from one day to another. You need to have the players getting used to it. They will have maybe some muscle DOMs, some muscle pain at the beginning, but hey, that's training, okay? Now let's go to another type of exercise. This is what I call the extended limb skips. So why do we use extended limbs? Very simple. First, if you extend the limb, your knee flexors will not be used for the propulsion. And second, you will put a lot of moment arm on the hip extensors. So this exercise is very useful to work on the gluteus, for example. If you want to add some instability and some balance control, you ask the players to lock the arms like this. They don't use their arms. What is the challenge here? Well, you can understand that if you don't have your arms, you have to also balance your body only using the legs and only using the hip extensors and the ankles. Of course, it may be challenging, so you have to do that cautiously with the players. You never go without arms if the motion is not controlled with the arms. It's a progression. Now let's look at another exercise to improve the forward orientation of the push. Sleds. So, my opinion on sleds is that any type of load is useful. Maybe you will see in another course that sometimes heavy sleds are better than light sleds. My opinion is that you should use both light and heavy sleds. Why? Because when you use light sleds, for example, 15% of body mass in this video, you can work on a 20-40 meter distance. You will have the player working at a high velocity. So he will work on pushing forward at a high velocity. Now, if you use a heavy sled, so in this example, 80% of body mass, of course you will work on shorter distances because you know it's very heavy, but in this case, you will work on pushing forward at the beginning of the sprint. So my opinion is that if you want the players to be able to push forward during the entire acceleration, you have to modulate the loads so they can work on every part of the acceleration. Look at the angle of the push with the heavy sleds. You have no other solution to induce this behavior and this horizontal push than using heavy sleds. Again, heavy sleds should be something you bring progressively into the training because as any heavy load training, you may risk injuries if you go too fast too soon. So be progressive. But believe me, this has a major consequence. Now look at the ankles of the player. If you work with heavy sleds, this will force your ankles to be very stiff and very strong. Why? Because if it's not the case, you will have difficulties pulling the sleds, very simply. So if a player has a low force transmission because of a low ankle strength, with a heavy sled, you will, boom, see it immediately. Now let's go to another type of exercise that is called the wall drills. I think it's a good warm-up exercise, okay? The objective here is to do a 1-2 step and to fix the thigh in an upper position. So you can do a 1-2-1-2 with the left knee up, and you can do a 1-2-1-2 with the right knee up. Remember, always when you work on one side of the body, always work the equivalent amount of exercises on the other side of the body. So you can see here what muscle group is working, ankle stiffness, because you already have short contact times and a very forefoot strike of the ground. And you work also on the hip extensors because they will push the leg downwards and then they will work isometrically. You can also modulate the wall drills here by alternating the knees. So it's like a step. And you can have this change of position. So you will see that step by step, I will take my body in a more horizontal orientation. You understand why? Because if I do that, I will finish the exercise with a more horizontal push. Now let's go to the lunges. In my opinion, the lunges are very important and very interesting, and you should do this often. Why? Because look, the starting position is with a very flexed hip, so it means that the gluteus muscles will work at a very long length, and they will produce a lot of force. So always remember, be explosive, jump as far as possible, as forward as possible. You understand here that if I push vertically, by definition, my body will not go far forward. So here, as you can notice, I work only on the left leg. So of course, you will have to do the exact same exercise with the right leg. Left, right, left, right. All right? Believe me, this exercise is very powerful to develop the hip extensors at a high velocity. You don't need any material, you just do it right there on the pitch. Now, let's talk about jumping. This is kind of a frog jump. It's a two-leg jump, and you will jump as far as possible. Always remember, push forward and be stable. You need the players to be stable before doing another jump. Okay? If the player is okay with this, you can do it without using the arms. So, always the same. Do no arms, only if the player is stable and okay with the previous exercise. This is a progression. But if you can be stable without the arms, it means that your body, your pelvis, your trunk, your legs are able to be stable without balancing the arms. And this is cool. Because football is very often a change of direction and unstable situations. Now let's go to the forward one leg jump. Here you see that I jump forward with only one leg push. It's very important to have single leg exercises because, again, in soccer, in football, we never use two legs, almost never. It's always one leg stances. If this is okay and it's stable, you can do the same without using the arms. So again, this might be used as a warm-up routine, as a training routine. If the players are okay, it's a very good way to work on everything. Hip extensors, ankles, and forward push. Now, we have what we call the hops. So it's only hopping on the same leg. So the big difference between a jump and a hop is that in the case of a hop, you jump and you land on the same leg. So this is very demanding because your leg is going to be tired, is going to fatigue, but it's a very good stimulus. I would say that this stimulus here is a bit more demanding, so it's a bit more like an SNC exercise. It's okay with the arms, then try that without the arms. So here, I did it the wrong way, but you should try to use the arms as less as possible. As you can see, I'm not able to do that. Now, let's try to see some exercises that basically integrate everything. So we work on both ankle stiffness and forward orientation. First, bouncing. When you bounce forward here, one leg, the other one, you work on everything because you need to be very stiff, short contact times, forward push, stable, always the same. Look at the same repetition now without the arms here. So it's going to be bounce, 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 bounce. You don't need to do more than 6 or 10 bounces. We don't want to fatigue the players here. Now, let's talk about the skips. So, skipping means bouncing into a running movement. So here in this video, for example, I will run and I will skip every 5 steps. This is very important for the players because you have to coordinate your body to respect this rhythm. One skip every 5 steps. So look at that. Skip, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, skip, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. So of course, when you skip every 5 steps, you change the legs. It's left, right, right, etc., etc. Then you can ask to skip every 4 steps, so the players will have to adapt their motor control. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. Always the same. When you skip, it's short contact time, forward. Then one skip every 3 steps. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's very important for the players to have more coordination challenges. And of course, one skip every 2 steps. So that's going to be 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, etc., etc. So the last exercise will be what we call the wicket runs. As you can see here, you put some wickets, very small obstacles on the ground, and you can have 20 or 40 meters. And you will ask the players to start at a low velocity and then accelerate into the wickets. Because when you do that and you have a high knee position, you will force the players to have this backward push onto the ground. And if you ask for an acceleration, then you will induce them to push horizontally. If you just ask them to go through the wickets, they will generate some speed and maintain the speed. So it is not very interesting. You should ask for acceleration. If they cannot accelerate, well, you can increase the space between the wickets. You can increase the intervals. So for example, you can go from 3 feet to 5 feet to 7 feet, and this will force the players to accelerate. So very important, you don't need a fast velocity before and going through the wickets. We don't want that. You need them to accelerate. So I would say start with a very high knee run and then into the wickets, accelerate forward. You can adapt that, of course. You can play on the length of the exercise and you can play on the intervals. You will have to adapt to what the players can do, of course. The last exercise will be some very short sprint acceleration. So you start the acceleration in a lunge position and you ask the players to have the first step with a maximum push. So you don't really care about the sprint that's after, you just care about the first 1, 2, 3 and 4 steps. This should be maximum and this should be horizontal. Why do we start in a lunge position? Of course you do left and right sprints, because when you start in a lunge position you will start again with a very flexed hip, and so you will have a very explosive hip work. That was the main exercises for this course, but of course you can generate many exercises. Remember, respect short contact times, ankle stiffness, velocity and forward push. See you.